My name is Patricia Dawson, but everyone calls me Pat. I'm 63 years old now, and when I look back at my life, I see a journey filled with unexpected turns, heartbreak, triumph, and ultimately a deep understanding of what it truly means to live. Born in the desert heat of Phoenix, Arizona, in 1962, I never imagined the path my life would take. I thought I knew exactly how things would unfold. Marry young, have children, live happily ever after. But life, as I've learned, rarely follows the script we write for ourselves. I've been a nurse for over 3 decades, dedicating my life to caring for others. I've held countless hands in hospital rooms, witnessed miracles and tragedies, and learned that healing isn't just about medicine. It's about human connection, compassion, and hope. But perhaps the greatest lesson came when I found myself on the other side of that hospital bed, fighting the battle of my life. At 45, when most people think their biggest challenges are behind them, I faced my greatest enemy, breast cancer. Those months of treatment stripped away everything I thought I knew about myself and rebuilt me into someone stronger, more resilient, and infinitely more grateful for each sunrise. Today, as a divorced woman who chose independence over settling, I spend my days traveling with my closest friends, exploring new cuisines, and embracing every moment with the fervor of someone who knows how precious life truly is. My story isn't perfect. It's messy, painful at times, but ultimately beautiful in its imperfection. If you've ever felt lost, if you've ever faced a challenge that seemed insurmountable, if you've ever wondered if you're strong enough to start over, then my story is for you. Because I'm here to tell you that sometimes the most beautiful chapters of our lives are written after we thought the story was over. Stay with me as I take you through the decades that shaped me, the moments that broke me, and the experiences that ultimately set me free. The year was 1962, and Phoenix was nothing like the sprawling metropolis it is today. Back then, it was a small desert town where everyone knew everyone, and dreams seemed as vast as the endless Arizona sky above us. I was born on a scorching July morning to Margaret and Robert Dawson. My mother always said I came into this world fighting, 2 weeks late, and determined to make my entrance on my own terms. Maybe that should have been a sign of things to come. My father worked construction, his weathered hands building the homes that would house Phoenix's growing population. He was a quiet man, but his love spoke through his actions. The way he'd check my window at night to make sure I was safe, how he'd wake up early on Saturdays to make pancakes shaped like animals, or the gentle way he taught me to ride my bike in our dusty backyard. My mother was the heart of our small home. She worked part-time at the local diner, serving coffee and comfort to anyone who needed it. From her, I learned that kindness costs nothing but is worth everything. She had this incredible ability to make anyone feel special, whether it was a lonely trucker passing through town or a child who scraped their knee playing in the street. Growing up in the desert taught me resilience early on. The unforgiving heat, the sudden thunderstorms, the way life seemed to bloom impossibly from the harsh, rocky ground. It all became part of who I was. I learned that beauty could be found in the most unlikely places, and that surviving meant adapting to whatever conditions life presented. Our neighborhood was filled with families just like ours, working-class people chasing the American dream, one paycheck at a time. There was Mrs. Rodriguez next door, who taught me Spanish while she cooked the most amazing tamales, and old Mr. Fletcher across the street, who let me help tend his impossible garden where he somehow grew tomatoes in the desert. School was my sanctuary. I threw myself into my studies with the same intensity the desert sun threw its heat. I wasn't the prettiest or the most popular, but I was determined. My teachers saw something in me, a hunger for knowledge, and a natural empathy that made me different from my peers. I remember the day I decided to become a nurse. I was 12 years old, when my grandmother fell ill. I watched my mother care for her with such tenderness, such skill, and I knew I wanted to spend my life healing people the way she was trying to heal Grandma. Even though we lost her that winter, the seed was planted. High school brought new challenges, and the first taste of heartbreak. I fell hard for Tommy Martinez, the star of our small school's basketball team. He had dark eyes and a smile that could melt ice in the middle of August. We dated for 2 years, making plans for a future that seemed so certain, so inevitable. But Tommy's family moved to California the summer before our senior year, taking my first love with them. I spent months writing letters that grew shorter and shorter, until eventually we just stopped. It was my first lesson in letting go, though I wouldn't fully understand its importance for decades to come. Despite the heartbreak, I graduated with honors and earned a scholarship to nursing school. The day I walked across that stage, seeing my parents' proud faces in the small crowd, I felt like I could conquer the world. Little did I know that the world had very different plans for me. Nursing school in Phoenix was everything I had dreamed of and nothing like I expected. The clinical hours were exhausting, the textbooks seemed endless, and the responsibility of holding someone's life in your hands was both thrilling and terrifying. I'll never forget my first day on the hospital floor. I was 19, wearing my crisp white uniform and nursing cap, trying to look confident while my knees shook like leaves in a windstorm. My supervising nurse, Mrs. Henderson, was a stern woman with kind eyes who became my first real mentor. "Patricia," she told me that first day, "being a good nurse isn't just about memorizing symptoms and procedures. It's about seeing the person behind the patient, understanding their fears, and becoming their advocate when they can't advocate for themselves." Those words would guide my entire career. My fellow students became my chosen family. There was Sarah, a fiery redhead from Texas who could make anyone laugh even during the most stressful situations. Jennifer, quiet and studious, who always knew the right thing to say when one of us was struggling. And Maria, whose family had immigrated from Mexico and who was determined to give back to her community through healthcare. We studied together, cried together, and celebrated small victories together. When one of us struggled with anatomy, we'd all stay up late quizzing each other until we got it right. When Jennifer's father had a heart attack during our second year, we rallied around her, taking notes for her classes and making sure she knew she wasn't alone. But it was during my third year that I met David Chen. He was a pre-med student doing his volunteer hours at the hospital, where I was completing my clinical rotation. Tall and lanky, with the most beautiful hands I'd ever seen, surgeon's hands, I used to tell him. He had an easy smile and a way of making even the most difficult days seem manageable. Our first conversation happened over a particularly challenging patient, an elderly man who refused to take his medication. David suggested we try a different approach, talking to the patient about his grandchildren instead of his illness. It worked like magic, and I was smitten. What started as professional collaboration turned into long conversations during break time, which became coffee dates, which eventually became something deeper than I had ever experienced with Tommy. David understood my passion for nursing, respected my dreams, and never tried to make me feel small for wanting to dedicate my life to caring for others. We spent hours talking about our future plans. He would become a surgeon. I would work in pediatric nursing, and together we'd make a difference in the world. He had this way of making everything seem possible, of making me believe that life would unfold exactly as we planned. The night I graduated from nursing school, David proposed. It wasn't elaborate, just him, me, and a simple ring under the desert stars, but it felt perfect. I was 22 years old and absolutely certain that I had found my forever. We married 6 months later in a small ceremony at my childhood church. My parents were thrilled, His family welcomed me with open arms, and our friends celebrated alongside us. I wore my grandmother's pearl necklace and carried desert wildflowers. And when David took my hands at that altar, I truly believed in happily ever after. Our early married years were a whirlwind of new careers and shared dreams. I landed my first nursing position at Phoenix Children's Hospital while David began medical school. We lived in a tiny apartment that barely had room for both our textbooks, but we were happy. We'd study together at our kitchen table, quiz each other on medical terminology, and fall asleep exhausted but content. I threw myself into pediatric nursing with everything I had. Working with children required a special kind of patience and creativity. I learned to distract scared kids with silly songs, to explain procedures in ways that made sense to young minds, and to comfort parents who were watching their children suffer. But even as I found my professional calling, I began to notice small cracks in my marriage that I chose to ignore, believing that love could overcome any obstacle. The first few years of marriage had a way of revealing truths that courtship had hidden. As David progressed through medical school, and I settled into my nursing career, we began to discover that the future we had planned together looked very different through each of our eyes. David's ambition was fierce and all-consuming. His days stretched from early morning rounds to late-night study sessions, and when he was home, he was often mentally still at the hospital. I understood the demands of medical training. I lived them too, but I began to feel like I was married to a ghost. Meanwhile, my work at the Children's Hospital was becoming more than just a job. It was my calling. I'd come home with stories about brave little patients fighting impossible odds, or families finding hope in the darkest moments. I needed David to share in these experiences, to understand why my work mattered so much to me. But when I tried to tell him about my day, he'd listen with half an ear while reviewing his surgery notes. When I suggested we take a weekend trip to reconnect, he'd remind me about his upcoming exams. When I brought up the possibility of starting a family, he'd say someday, in a way that made someday feel like never. The loneliness crept in slowly, like water seeping through a crack in a dam. I threw myself deeper into my work, taking on extra shifts and volunteering for the most challenging cases. There was 8-year-old Emma, who was battling leukemia with the spirit of a warrior. She taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing to smile even when you're terrified. There was little Marcus, born with a heart defect, whose parents never left his bedside. From them, I learned that love isn't just a feeling. It's a choice you make every single day. These families, these children, they became my teachers in ways David never suspected. They showed me what it meant to fight for what matters, to prioritize the people you love, and to never take a single moment for granted. As David began his surgical residency, the distance between us grew from a crack to a chasm. He'd come home exhausted and irritable, complaining about attending physicians, difficult cases, and the impossible hours. I'd try to be supportive, but I was fighting my own battles at work and feeling increasingly alone in my marriage. The conversations we used to have about changing the world together became arguments about whose career was more demanding, whose schedule was more important, whose dreams deserved priority. We were keeping score in a game where both players could only lose. I remember the night everything changed. I had just gotten home from a particularly difficult shift where we'd lost a patient, a 6-year-old boy named Joshua who had fought so bravely against his illness. I needed David's comfort, his understanding, his presence. Instead, I found him at the kitchen table, surrounded by medical journals, barely acknowledging my arrival. When I tried to tell him about Joshua, about how much it hurt to lose a child I'd cared for, he looked up from his reading long enough to say, "Pat, I can't deal with your emotional stuff right now. I have boards in 3 weeks." My emotional stuff. That's what my pain, my grief, my need for connection had become to him. That night, lying in bed next to a man who felt like a stranger, I realized that somewhere along the way, we had stopped being partners and had become roommates living parallel lives. We shared a space, but we no longer shared a life. I began to understand that love alone wasn't enough to sustain a marriage. You needed presence, attention, shared priorities, and a willingness to show up for each other even when it was inconvenient, especially when it was inconvenient. The irony wasn't lost on me that while I was helping families heal at the hospital, my own relationship was slowly dying from neglect. But I wasn't ready to give up yet. I still believed that if I just tried harder, if I was more understanding, if I demanded less, we could find our way back to each other. I was about to learn that sometimes trying harder only postpones the inevitable. By the time I turned 30, I had become an expert at making excuses for my marriage. David was just focused on his career. The residency was temporary. Things would get better once he became an attending physician. Once we bought a house. Once we started a family. Once. I had become a master of once, living in a future that never seemed to arrive. David finally finished his residency and landed a position at a prestigious surgical practice in Scottsdale. We bought our first house, a beautiful adobe home with a pool and a view of the mountains. On paper, our life looked perfect. In reality, we were further apart than ever. The success that was supposed to bring us together only highlighted how different we had become. David threw himself into his practice with the same intensity he'd shown in medical school, working 60-hour weeks and taking calls that interrupted our rare moments together. His colleagues became his social circle, his cases became his passion, and his achievements became his identity. I tried to be the supportive wife. I attended medical conference dinners, smiled at hospital fundraisers, and pretended that I didn't feel invisible standing next to my accomplished surgeon husband. People would ask me what I did, and when I'd mention nursing, they'd nod politely before turning back to David to discuss his latest surgical triumph. But my work continued to fulfill me in ways my marriage didn't. I had been promoted to head nurse in the pediatric ICU, a position that came with enormous responsibility and even greater rewards. I was supervising a team of dedicated nurses, implementing new protocols that improved patient outcomes, and serving as a liaison between families and medical staff during their most vulnerable moments. The children and families I cared for taught me daily lessons about resilience, about what really mattered in life, about the difference between existing and truly living. Meanwhile, at home, David and I moved around each other like polite strangers, sharing space but not lives. The breaking point came on my 32nd birthday. I had planned a small dinner party, inviting our closest friends to celebrate at home. I spent days preparing David's favorite dishes, decorating the house, and looking forward to one evening where we could simply enjoy each other's company. I had even bought a new dress, something I rarely did for myself. David arrived home 3 hours late. His surgery had run long, he explained, and he'd stopped by the hospital to check on his patient. Important responsibilities that I, as a nurse, should understand. I did understand. What I couldn't understand was why he hadn't called, why my birthday wasn't important enough for him to arrange coverage, why I was always the one expected to understand while my needs remained unmet. Our guests had already left by the time he arrived. The carefully prepared dinner had grown cold. The birthday cake sat untouched on the counter. I was sitting alone at our dining room table, still wearing my new dress, wondering when I had become so invisible in my own life. "I'm sorry, Pat," he said, loosening his tie. "You know how important these cases are." And in that moment, something inside me broke. Not dramatically, not with anger or tears, but with a quiet, devastating clarity. "What about me, David?" I asked. "Am I important?" He paused, and in that pause I had my answer. Of course you are. You're my wife. But being someone's wife isn't the same as being important to them. It's a title, not a relationship. It's a role to fill, not a person to cherish. That night marked the beginning of the end of our marriage, though neither of us was ready to admit it yet. We continued the charade for 3 more years, going through the motions of a relationship while growing further apart emotionally and spiritually. I stopped making excuses for him. I stopped waiting for him to change. I stopped believing that love could overcome fundamental incompatibility and emotional neglect. Most importantly, I stopped making myself smaller to accommodate his indifference. Instead, I began to rediscover who Patricia Dawson was when she wasn't trying to be the perfect surgeon's wife. I started taking cooking classes, joined a book club, and began traveling with friends from work. I learned that I didn't need David's presence to have fulfilling experiences, and that realization was both liberating and heartbreaking. The marriage was ending long before either of us was brave enough to say the words out loud. The decision to end my marriage didn't come like lightning. It came like dawn, slowly and then all at once. By the time I turned 35, David and I had become expert roommates, dividing household responsibilities and maintaining separate social calendars while sharing the same address. I had spent years trying to be the wife I thought he needed, shrinking myself to fit into the narrow space his life allowed for me. But working with families facing life and death situations every day had taught me something crucial. Life is too short and too precious to waste on relationships that make you feel invisible. The conversation happened on a Tuesday evening in March. David was reading medical journals at the kitchen counter while I prepared dinner, a scene we'd replayed thousands of times. But this time, instead of accepting the familiar silence, I turned off the stove and sat down across from him. "We need to talk," I said. He looked up with the mild irritation of someone being interrupted from important work. "About what?" "About us. About this marriage. About the fact that we're living like strangers." What followed wasn't an argument. It was worse. It was a calm, clinical discussion about the failure of our relationship. David admitted he'd been unhappy too, that we'd grown in different directions, that maybe we'd married too young. There were no dramatic accusations, no revelations of affairs or betrayals, just the quiet acknowledgement that we had tried to love each other in ways that didn't match what the other needed. The divorce proceedings were surprisingly amicable. We divided our assets fairly, sold the house, and wished each other well. David remarried 2 years later, a fellow surgeon who understood his world in ways I never could. I attended their wedding reception and genuinely wished them happiness. But ending my marriage wasn't just about legally dissolving a partnership. It was about rediscovering who I was as an individual woman, not someone's wife. At 35, I was starting over, and it was both terrifying and exhilarating. I found a small apartment near the hospital, a cozy space that was entirely mine. I painted the walls bright colors, hung artwork I loved, and filled the rooms with plants that thrived under my care. For the first time since college, my living space reflected my personality instead of compromise. My work took on new meaning during this transition. Caring for children facing uncertain futures reminded me daily that resilience isn't something you're born with. It's something you develop through facing difficulties and choosing to keep going. Every brave child I met, every family that found strength they didn't know they possessed, became a mirror showing me my own capacity for renewal. I also began to build deeper friendships with my colleagues. Without the obligations of marriage, I had time and energy to invest in relationships that had been neglected. Sarah and Jennifer, my old nursing school friends, became my chosen family. We started a tradition of monthly dinners where we'd share stories, offer support, and celebrate each other's triumphs. Dating felt impossible at first. How do you trust your judgment about men when your marriage had failed so completely? How do you open your heart again when it's still healing from the last disappointment? I went on a few awkward dates, coffee meetings that felt more like job interviews than romantic encounters. But I was learning something important. Being alone didn't have to mean being lonely. I was discovering interests I'd never had time to pursue, opinions I'd never been encouraged to express, and dreams I'd put aside to support someone else's ambitions. I started taking cooking classes, not because I needed to feed a family, but because I wanted to explore flavors and techniques that brought me joy. I joined a hiking group that explored Arizona's beautiful desert trails every weekend. I began planning solo trips to places I'd always wanted to visit, but had never prioritized. The most significant change was internal. I stopped apologizing for taking up space, for having needs, for expecting the people in my life to show up for me the way I showed up for them. I learned to set boundaries, to say no without explanation, and to prioritize my own well-being without guilt. My divorce had taught me that staying in the wrong relationship is often more painful than being alone, and that ending something that isn't working isn't failure. It's courage. My late 30s and early 40s became a period of remarkable personal growth. Free from the constraints of a marriage that had never truly fit, I began to understand what it meant to live authentically, making choices based on my own values and desires rather than someone else's expectations. Work continued to be my anchor and my passion. I had been promoted to nursing supervisor for the entire pediatric wing, a role that combined patient care with leadership responsibilities. I was mentoring new nurses, developing training programs, and serving as a bridge between families and medical staff during their most challenging moments. One of my greatest professional accomplishments was implementing a family-centered care program that revolutionized how we approached pediatric treatment. Instead of viewing parents as visitors in their children's medical care, we made them partners. We trained them to participate in certain procedures, included them in medical rounds, and created spaces where families could maintain some normalcy during extended hospital stays. The program was so successful that other hospitals began sending representatives to study our methods. I was invited to speak at nursing conferences across the country, sharing our approaches and learning from colleagues who were doing innovative work in their own communities. But it wasn't just professional success that marked this period of my life. I was also discovering who Patricia Dawson was outside of her career identity. The cooking classes led to elaborate dinner parties for friends. The hiking group introduced me to photography, and I began documenting Arizona's desert landscapes with the same attention to detail I brought to patient care. I traveled more during this time than I had in my entire previous life combined. A culinary tour through Italy taught me that food is love made visible. A photography workshop in Costa Rica showed me that adventure doesn't have an expiration date. A meditation retreat in Colorado introduced me to mindfulness practices that would become essential tools for managing stress and staying present. These solo adventures weren't just about seeing new places. They were about proving to myself that I could navigate unfamiliar territories with confidence, that I didn't need a companion to validate my experiences or ensure my safety. Each trip reinforced my growing sense of independence and self-reliance. I also began to develop deeper, more meaningful friendships during this period. Without the time constraints of a demanding marriage, I could invest in relationships that nourished rather than drained me. My friend circle expanded to include colleagues, neighbors, hiking companions, and fellow travel enthusiasts. We supported each other through career challenges, family crises, and personal celebrations. When Jennifer's mother was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, we rallied around her with meal trains and emotional support. When Sarah decided to pursue her master's degree at 42, we became her study group and cheerleading squad. These friendships taught me that chosen family can be just as strong and supportive as biological family, and that women supporting women creates a network of strength that can withstand any challenge. Dating remained sporadic and generally disappointing. I went through brief relationships with a fellow nurse who turned out to be recently separated but not emotionally divorced, a divorced teacher who was lovely but wanted someone to help raise his teenage children, and a widower who was clearly still grieving his late wife. Each relationship taught me something about what I did and didn't want in a partner. I learned that compatibility required more than shared interests. It required similar values, communication styles, and life philosophies. I also learned that being selective wasn't being picky, it was being wise. By my early 40s, I had created a life that felt full and satisfying. I had meaningful work, strong friendships, diverse interests, and a growing confidence in my ability to handle whatever challenges life presented. I felt strong, capable, and ready for whatever came next. I had no idea that my greatest test was just around the corner. It was a Tuesday morning in October when I found the lump. I was getting ready for work, moving through my usual routine, when my fingers detected something that shouldn't have been there, a small, hard mass in my left breast that seemed to have appeared overnight. For a moment, I stood frozen in my bathroom, my nursing knowledge warring with my human hope. I knew the statistics, understood the importance of early detection, and recognized the signs I'd educated countless patients about over the years. But knowing something intellectually is entirely different from experiencing it personally. My first instinct was denial. It was probably just a cyst, I told myself. A hormonal fluctuation. Something benign that would resolve itself. I was only 45, relatively healthy, with no family history of breast cancer. This couldn't be happening to me. But I was a nurse first, and I knew better than to ignore what my body was telling me. I called my doctor that morning and scheduled an appointment for the same day. Dr. Martinez had been my physician for years, and I could see the concern in her eyes even as she maintained professional composure during the examination. She ordered a mammogram and ultrasound immediately, and by that afternoon, I was sitting in a radiology waiting room wearing a hospital gown that tied in the back, feeling more vulnerable than I had in years. The mammogram was uncomfortable, but familiar. I'd encouraged countless women to get this screening. The ultrasound was more detailed, and I watched the technician's face carefully for any telltale signs of what she was seeing on the screen. Years of reading medical professionals' expressions served me well. I could see the concern she was trying to hide. The biopsy came next, scheduled for the following week. Those days of waiting were among the longest of my life. I continued working, maintained my normal routine, and tried not to let my colleagues see the fear that was growing inside me like a cancer itself. When Dr. Martinez called with the results, I was at home, grading training materials for new nurses. Her voice was gentle but direct. "Pat, I need you to come in. The biopsy showed invasive ductal carcinoma. We need to discuss treatment options." Breast cancer. The words echoed in my head like a diagnosis delivered to someone else. This happened to other people, to my patients' mothers and sisters, not to me. I was the caregiver, not the patient. I was the one who held hands and offered comfort, not the one who needed holding. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of medical appointments, second opinions, and treatment planning. I met with oncologists, surgeons, and radiation specialists. I learned new vocabulary, chemotherapy protocols, tumor markers, staging, and survival rates. I became fluent in a language I'd never wanted to speak. The treatment plan was aggressive but hopeful. Chemotherapy would come first to shrink the tumor, followed by surgery, then radiation therapy. My oncologist, Dr. Chen, no relation to my ex-husband, was straightforward about what lay ahead. I would lose my hair, experience significant fatigue, and deal with side effects that would challenge every aspect of my daily life. But I would also have an excellent chance of beating this disease completely. The night before my first chemotherapy treatment, I sat in my bathroom looking at myself in the mirror, really looking. My hair was shoulder length and brown with just a few threads of silver. My face showed the confidence and competence of a woman who had spent decades caring for others. Tomorrow, the battle for my life would begin, and I would need to draw on every lesson those years of nursing had taught me. I thought about all the brave children I'd cared for, kids who faced much scarier diagnoses with incredible courage. If they could find strength in their fear, so could I. The fight was about to begin, but I wasn't going into it alone or unprepared. Chemotherapy was everything the doctors warned me it would be, and worse than I had imagined. The first treatment left me nauseated for 3 days straight, and by the end of the second week, my hair began falling out in clumps. I made the decision to shave it off completely rather than watch it disappear gradually, one small way to maintain control in a situation where I felt powerless. But if cancer taught me anything, it was that I was far stronger than I had ever realized. My colleagues at the hospital became my support network in ways that humbled and sustained me. They covered my shifts when I was too sick to work, brought meals to my apartment when I couldn't cook, and never made me feel like a burden or a patient. Sarah, now the head of pediatric nursing at another hospital, took a leave of absence to be with me during the worst weeks of treatment. "You've held so many hands over the years," she told me when I protested her sacrifice. "Now it's time to let someone hold yours." The children in my ward became unexpected sources of inspiration. When I returned to work between treatments, wearing colorful scarves to cover my bald head, they accepted my appearance without question. 8-year-old Emma, still fighting her own battle with leukemia, told me I looked like a beautiful queen in disguise. From the mouths of babes came the wisdom I needed to hear. My ex-husband David sent flowers and a card wishing me well, a gesture that touched me more than I expected. We had grown apart as spouses, but the foundation of caring that had brought us together still existed. His note said simply, "You're the strongest person I know. You've got this." The surgery in December was successful. The tumor had responded well to chemotherapy, and the surgeons were confident they had removed all the cancerous tissue. The weeks of radiation therapy that followed were exhausting but manageable, and by spring, my hair was beginning to grow back in soft, silvery curls that made me look like a different person entirely. But the real transformation wasn't physical, it was spiritual and emotional. Cancer stripped away everything that wasn't essential and showed me what truly mattered. It wasn't career achievements or professional recognition, though I was grateful for work that gave my life meaning. It wasn't the perfect house or the ideal relationship, though I appreciated the comfort of my cozy apartment and valued relationships more deeply than ever. What mattered was presence, being fully alive in each moment, appreciating simple pleasures, and connecting authentically with the people who shared my journey. It was morning coffee that tasted like gratitude, sunsets that painted the desert sky in colors I'd never really noticed before, and conversations with friends that went beyond surface pleasantries to touch the depths of human experience. Cancer also taught me about receiving. I, who had spent decades giving care to others, had to learn how to accept help gracefully, to admit vulnerability without shame, and to understand that allowing others to support me was actually a gift to them, not a burden. The experience changed how I practiced nursing too. I had always been competent and compassionate, but now I brought a deeper understanding of what it felt like to be on the other side of medical care. I understood the particular terror of waiting for test results, the way small kindnesses from healthcare workers could illuminate entire days, and the importance of hope balanced with honesty. By my 46th birthday, celebrated with a party full of friends and colleagues who had walked through the fire with me, I was officially cancer-free. But more than that, I was free from the fear of living fully. I had faced my mortality and survived, and that experience had given me permission to embrace life with an intensity I'd never allowed myself before. The woman who emerged from cancer treatment was different from the one who had received that diagnosis. She was braver, more grateful, clearer about her priorities, and absolutely determined not to waste a single day of the life she'd fought so hard to keep. Recovery from cancer isn't just about clear scans and normal blood work. It's about learning to trust your body again, to make plans for a future you weren't sure you'd have, and to integrate the lessons of survival into a life worth living fully. As I entered my late 40s, I found myself reassessing everything with the clarity that comes from facing mortality head-on. My work remained important, but I no longer define myself entirely by my professional identity. My relationships became more precious, and I invested time and energy only in connections that were mutual and meaningful. Most significantly, I began to prioritize experiences over possessions, adventure over security, and joy over mere contentment. The first major change was my decision to take early retirement from full-time nursing at 55. I had saved diligently over the years. My cancer treatment was fully covered by excellent insurance, and I realized that financial security meant nothing if I didn't have the time and energy to enjoy it. Instead of stopping work entirely, I transitioned to consulting, helping other hospitals implement family-centered care programs, and training new nurses in pediatric care. This arrangement gave me the flexibility to work when I wanted while leaving time for the adventures I had postponed for too long. Travel became my passion and my therapy. The first major trip was to Ireland with Sarah and Jennifer, 3 women in their 50s exploring the countryside, staying in bed and breakfasts, and laughing until our sides hurt. We hiked along coastal cliffs, visited ancient castles, and spent evenings in pubs listening to traditional music and sharing stories with locals. That trip opened floodgates of wanderlust that had been dammed up for decades. Over the next few years, I explored Morocco's spice markets, walked portions of Spain's Camino de Santiago, took cooking classes in Thailand, and went on safari in Kenya. Each destination taught me something new about the world and about myself. But travel wasn't just about exotic destinations. Some of my most meaningful adventures happened closer to home, exploring the American Southwest with groups of fellow retirees who had discovered that life after 50 could be the most exciting chapter yet. Food became another avenue for exploration and connection. The cooking classes I'd started in my 30s evolved into a serious hobby. I learned to make authentic Italian pasta from a grandmother in Tuscany, mastered the art of French pastry during a week in Provence, and discovered the complex spice blends of Indian cuisine during a month-long culinary adventure through India. Back home in Phoenix, I hosted elaborate dinner parties that brought together friends from different chapters of my life, former colleagues, travel companions, neighbors, and fellow food enthusiasts. These gatherings became legendary in our circle, not for their sophistication, but for their warmth and the way they created space for real connection. During this period, I also began dating again, but with a completely different approach than in my 40s. I wasn't looking for someone to complete me or fix me. Cancer had taught me I was already whole. Instead, I was open to meeting someone who could complement the full, rich life I had already built. I went on dates with a retired teacher who shared my love of literature, a fellow traveler who introduced me to wine tasting, and a widowed doctor who made me laugh until I cried. None of these relationships developed into anything serious, but each one taught me more about what I valued in a companion and what I was willing to compromise on, which I discovered wasn't much. The most important relationship I developed during this time was with a group of women who, like me, had reinvented themselves after 50. We called ourselves the Phoenix Rising Group, a name that made us laugh, but also captured something essential about our shared experience of transformation. There was Margaret, a former corporate executive who had started her own consulting business. Linda, a divorced mother of 3 who had gone back to school to become a therapist. Carol, a widow who had discovered a talent for photography. And Susan, a retired military officer who was now teaching self-defense classes to women. We met monthly for dinner and traveled together quarterly, exploring destinations that challenged us physically, intellectually, or spiritually. We supported each other through health scares, family crises, and the occasional romantic disappointment. Most importantly, we celebrated each other's triumphs and reminded each other that our best years weren't behind us, they were happening right now. These friendships became the foundation of my new life, proving that family isn't just about blood relations, but about the people who choose to walk alongside you through all of life's seasons. As I approached 60, I realized I had created something I'd never had before, a life that was entirely my own, shaped by my choices and values rather than others' expectations. Today, at 63, I wake up each morning with gratitude for the journey that brought me to this place. My life didn't follow the script I wrote at 22, when I thought happiness meant checking off a list of conventional achievements. Instead, it became something far more interesting, a story of resilience, reinvention, and the courage to keep growing even when growth meant letting go of who I thought I was supposed to be. The woman I am today was forged in the fires of disappointment, divorce, and disease, but also shaped by the joys of meaningful work, authentic friendship, and adventures that feed my soul. I learned that strength isn't about avoiding difficult experiences. It's about walking through them with grace and allowing them to transform you into someone wiser, braver, and more compassionate. My scars tell stories now. The surgical scar from my cancer treatment reminds me daily that I am a survivor, that I chose to fight for my life when it would have been easier to surrender to fear. The laugh lines around my eyes speak of countless moments of joy shared with friends around dinner tables in Phoenix and on mountainsides in Morocco. If I could go back and tell my younger self anything, it would be this. Your life will not look like what you planned, and that's not a tragedy. It's a gift. The detours will teach you things the straight path never could. The endings will make space for beginnings you never imagined. The courage to start over will become your greatest strength. To anyone listening who feels stuck, scared, or uncertain about the future, remember that transformation is always possible. It's never too late to choose differently, to prioritize what matters, to say no to what diminishes you, and yes to what makes you come alive. Life isn't about avoiding storms. It's about learning to dance in the rain, to find beauty in the unexpected, and to trust that even the darkest chapters can lead to the most beautiful endings. My story continues to unfold, and I can't wait to see what adventures await in the pages yet to be written.